Hello, everybody. We did it. Today, we're going to be reading the last chapter of the Galileo Connection, Resolving Conflicts Between Science and the Bible by Charles E. Hummel, chapter 13, Connections, Theology, and Science. In his 1880s address to students at Yale Divinity School, Professor Asa Gray, the eminent Harvard botanist, concluded, "We students of natural science and theology have very similar tasks. Nature is a complex of which the human race, through investigation, is learning more and more the meaning and the uses. The scriptures are complex, an accumulation of a long series of records which are to be well understood only by investigation. So far in our study, we've emphasized the differences that exist between the biblical and scientific perspectives on the natural world. The book of Scripture and the book of nature each have their own languages. Their explanations of the universe serve different through complementary purposes, but in some ways they're also similar. How should the two perspectives be related? Personal knowledge. Until recently, the popular picture of the objective scientist has prevailed. A researcher detached and unemotional, methodically solves scientific problems and makes discoveries through cold logic and observation. In reality, the situation is radically different. Michael Polanyi, distinguished professor of physical chemistry and philosopher of science, has convincingly argued that all knowledge is personal. All human knowing takes place within a framework, a faith structure, of unprovable commitments that motivate and guide the knower in acquiring knowledge. A person's faith structure includes a wide range of beliefs, multiple presuppositions, the universe is orderly, to mundane confidence, the sun will rise tomorrow. The former must be assumed, the latter is based on sense perception. Also important is one's tacit knowledge, unseen and inexpressible, which forms a kind of foundation for all other knowledge. Lack of formal proof, certainty, does not mean that faith has no evidence. It's in either theology or science. Whether ultimate or mundane, faith is not blind. It arises from and is embedded in evidence assimilated from our experience. The main point is that for everyone in all fields of study, including science, faith is a motivating and unifying component in knowing. Further, such knowing is not merely a function of the mind focusing on ideas. It is a function of the whole purpose, encountering the totality of human experience. In other words, not just the intellectual, but also the emotional, volitional, spiritual, and physical dimensions of our being are part of the process. Our knowledge includes events of history and relationships with others, as well as observations of physical reality. In this respect, scientific knowledge is intensely personal. Research is far from being detached and unemotional. The love of science is a recurring phrase in Polanyi's writings. From his own experience, he affirms that scientists work consensuously, responsibly, and ardently. Scientists who would lose all their passion for science and take up instead an interest in breeding greyhounds would instantly cease to form a scientific society. A scientist's faith structure is operative at every stage of research. No one can do science without believing that the scientific method and its presuppositions are fundamentally valid and can be unquestionably accepted. Polanyi concludes, "We have here an instance of the process described epigrammatically by the Christian Church fathers in the words, fides quaerens intellectum, faith in search of understanding." For example, a scientist that is perplexed by a problem or puzzle as yet unsolved. Belief that a solution can be discovered leads to research. Such faith provides a motivation and courage for long months, even years of fruitless efforts and frustrating dead ends, as with Kepler wrestling with the orbit of Mars or Galileo perplexed by the problem appearance, continuing to gain strength both by further reflection and additional evidence. Polanyi identifies four phases present in all fields of creative activity: preparation, incubation, illumination, and verification. With Copernicus and Newton, the illumination came relatively early, but many years passed before verification was achieved. Scientists persevere in the belief that ultimately the scientific community will recognize what is true in their work. Although each discovery is personal, the validity of a hypothesis is not an individual decision, but one made by the community to which scientists are committed. Commitment and community. Throughout their careers, scientists as well as theologians are personally associated with a community that requires commitment to its tradition and authority. At the outset, they become apprentices in order to be trained in the scientific tradition. Polanyi observed that although rules can guide scientific discovery, they are merely rules of art. Their application requires the exercise of creativity. A precise prescription can manufacture a product, but that does not create a work of art. Since an art cannot be precisely defined, it can be transmitted only by the examples of the practice which embodies it. He who would learn from a master by watching him must trust his example. must recognize the authoritative the art he wishes to learn and those of whom he would learn it. So novices enter the scientific community where they are given a long, painstaking initiation into methods and standards. They must claim on the ground on which their mentors stand that they can achieve their own interdependence. At every stage of that process, the apprentices are sustained by faith that nature can be understood and that certain things, as yet beyond their understanding, are true and valuable. The two legs on which scientific training progresses are faith in the whole enterprise and commitment to the authority of its leaders. Not even the last stage takes place in individual isolation. Even when a new discovery initially meets resistance inside and outside the scientific community, the researcher recognizes the community's ultimate judgment. From start to finish, scientists' work is characterized by a commitment to the community. Eventually, they become senior members engaged in evaluating the work of others. Polanyi draws parallels in law and Christianity. In both, there is a community of consciences jointly rooted in the same ideals recognized by all. The community between an embodiment of those ideals and a living demonstration of their reality. Those principles and steps are evident in the astronomy of Copernicus and in the leadership of both Moses and Saul of Tarsus. Each was characterized by conversion and lifelong commitment. Finally, if a scientist's work is valid, it will contain within it the seeds of a new truth to be discovered. The theory or law is in touch with reality and also points the way to further research. Most complex theories need correction. For example, Copernicus's new model of the solar system retained the ancient ideal circular orbits until they were replaced by Kepler's ellipses and laws of motion, preparing the way for Newton's discovery of universal gravitation. Likewise, the visions of both Moses in the desert and Saul on the road to Damascus not only brought them into the reality of God's purpose for his people, but also led to new discoveries by those who followed him. Similarities and differences. Figure 11 summarizes major ways in which the biblical and scientific approaches to the natural world are similar and different. This chart and the current discussion consider only the physical and biological sciences, not the social sciences. They look only at the biblical theology and not natural theology. In light of the differences and similarities between the scientific and biblical views of nature, how should they be related? Two models for relating them have been the most prominent, the two realm and the concordist views, each of which has several varieties. 1. Two realms. Most discussions view theology and science as having radically different spheres, jurisdictions, or arenas. Although the realms are defined in different ways, they inevitably raise a problem of territorial disputes. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas related Aristotle's natural science to reason and Christian theology to faith. According to Aquinas, the scientists use reasons to study the natural world and explain the way it works, which can also provide proof for the existence of God. By faith, the theologian accepts the revealed truths of Christianity, such as the Trinity and Incarnation, which cannot be discovered through reasoning. Unfortunately, in later centuries, the Thomistic model was used to support an unwarranted antithesis between reason and faith, which still prevails in current discussion. For example, science and faith is commonly used as a label for the difference between science and theology, though both require reasoning faith or trusting reason. Each relies on a method of interaction between hypothesis and observations, whether scientific theory, experimental data, or theological doctrine, or in biblical statements. The Thomistic formulation also led to the God of the gaps functioning only in unexplained natural events and eventually restricted largely to the arena of human relationships. During the 19th century, liberal theologians following Friedrich Schleiermacher and Albrecht Ritschl defined the two realms as entirely separate spheres. No conflict or encroachment was possible since the supernatural and natural planes of being and acting did not intersect. Such theologians rejected reconciliations like that of James McCosh, who insisted that theology had the right to make metaphysical assertions about nature. They viewed Christianity as essentially an ethical and social teaching arising from and acting on feeling, not knowledge. Some did recognize that since science cannot discover God and his purposes, its strictly causative explanation of nature must be subordinated to religion. However, the redefinition of Christianity bore little resemblance to the biblical teaching that moral and ethical principles are firmly grounded in God's self-revelation through historical and natural events. 20th century neo-orthodoxy, led by Karl Barth and Emil Brunner, emphasized the transcendence of God and the gulf between divine revelation and the results of human inquiry of any sort, including science. According to that view, theology deals with the infinite God who can only be known through special revelation, in which he takes the initiative. Science makes statements about observable phenomena, deals with the finite, and uses a human methodology. Theology and science deal with different realms and are so incongruent. Although neo-orthodoxy appeared in a variety of versions, several basic beliefs laid the foundation for its wall between theology and science. First, A desire for religious certainty required that theological doctrine not be dependent on the changing results of higher criticism, whether historical or scientific. Second, revelation was thought to prove a different source of knowledge from that reason or sensory experience. Therefore, it produces different kinds of knowledge. Third, neo-orthodoxy supposed that revelation is propositional, so its content escapes rational scrutiny. Fourth, the radical distinction between God and his creation contributed farther to an intellectual mapping that placed theology and science in different hemispheres. This approach also tended to reinforce a false antithesis between faith and reason. The two-realm model in its various versions fails to do justice to the biblical revelation and its teaching about the natural world. Theology and science need not be domiciled in adjacent territories with disputed boundaries separated by a Berlin Wall. They should not be assigned to unrelated realms. Theology and science do live in the same world and observe some of the same phenomena. Number 2, concordism. A second approach, also with the various versions, attempts to harmonize the biblical and scientific explanations of nature on the same plane. It assumes that both produce pieces of jigsaw puzzle that present a picture of the natural world. For example, the Genesis account of creation is thought by some to provide historical scientific information by divine revelation to supplement the data gained through geological study. Together, the two sources of information are thought to provide an explanation on how the earth has developed since its creation. For example, a recent book interprets Genesis 1 verse by verse with words and phrases explained and correlated with modern science information. A detailed chart and diagram show how neatly the two sources of data fit. The writers state, "It is hoped that this book will encourage Christians in believing that God has communicated basic and even complex scientific truths in the non-technical vocabulary of ancient Israel." Theologian Bernard Ram has described many earlier attempts, including some endeavored to find anticipations of modern science hidden in odd texts and terms. The concordist approach has several significant flaws. From a hermeneutical standpoint, it appears to be a new version of Origen's allegorical method of interpretation. To his literal, moral, and spiritual senses of a text was added later an anagogical meaning. See Chapter 8. Now we're supposed to look for a fifth scientific sense as well. For example, in addition to other senses of the word day in Genesis 1, the concordist model adds a scientific meaning of the geological era, which would have been meaningless to the first hearers and to everybody else until about 200 years ago. In this approach, biblical interpretation becomes increasingly complicated and potentially fanciful. The concordist model has other weaknesses. Since scientific explanation is subject to change, it periodically replaces the pieces of its puzzle with others which form a new picture. As a result, the current puzzle with others form a new picture. As a result, the current biblical pieces no longer fit and must be reshaped if they are to contribute to that new picture. In other words, theological contribution, as long as it may be needed, constantly depends for its validity on the scientific setting. However, despite the concordist assumption that science and theology provide pieces designed for the same puzzle, in reality they belong to different pictures. The impersonal mathematical mechanism of a science contrasts with a biblical portrait of a personal God with plan and purpose for his world. To change the metaphor, how can two people play a single game of Scrabble with different kinds of language, the numbers of science and the words of Bible? Since the language of natural sciences is mathematics, with an alphabet consisting of numbers, the words of biblical everyday language can hardly contribute to the scientific explanation of nature. The concordist model endeavors to show that the Bible is scientifically accurate, but it fails to consider the question, whose science? The cosmology of Aristotle and Ptolemy, or that of Copernicus? For 1500 years, the Bible was considered scientifically accurate with its fixed earth and moving sun. As a result, many biblical scholars opposed a new cosmology. In the 19th century, history repeated itself as the Bible, now tied to Newton's world machine, was used to reject the developing world of Darwin. George Santayana observed that if we do not learn from the lessons of history, we are doomed to repeat its errors. The concordist approach has yet to learn the self-defeating nature of its program. For many people, the Church has never recovered the respect it forfeited by convicting Galileo, nor has the Genesis account of creation regained the credibility it lost because the literalist interpretations have been martialed against the theory of evolution. A theology that weds the science of one generation is likely to find itself a widow in the next. Perspectives on nature. The natural world, like the whole of reality, has many facts. They can be viewed from a variety of perspectives. Among them, the biblical and scientific descriptions can be regarded as two distinct but partial views. For example, imagine four individuals: Einstein, Gauguin, Beethoven, and King David, standing on a hilltop surveying a magnificent valley bathed in late afternoon sunlight. They admire a pastoral panorama framed by gold-red clouds. Although they are looking at the same scene, they each perceive something different. They agree to represent their perceptions, each with his own medium, and they meet to share them with another. 6 months later, the four reassemble. Einstein and the scientists produce sheets of paper filled with mathematical formulas to scientifically explain the relative motions of the Earth and Sun, the color of the light, and the composition of the clouds. Gauguin, the artist, holds up a canvas conveying the beauty of the sunset displayed in its variety of brilliant colors. Beethoven, the musician, passes around the score of his pastoral symphony and asks his colleagues to close their eyes and listen to the recording he has brought along. Finally, David the psalmist sings out, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands," the opening lines of Psalm 19. Which is the best description? The answer depends on the purpose of the inquirer. If one wishes to go to the moon or launch a space shuttle, Einstein's formulas would prove most helpful. But over the mantle of a fireplace, many would rather hang Gauguin's painting. After a very busy day, we might prefer to close our eyes and listen to Beethoven's music, and to express appreciation and praise of the Creator, we would choose the words of David's psalm. Not only does nature have varied facets, but people have many dimensions of experience. Whole person encounter with a complex environment neither compartmentalized life nor reduces explanations of nature to one perspective. In such a partial view model, the biblical and scientific descriptions are complementary perspectives, different kinds of maps for the same terrain. See Chapter 9. The respective limitations are not a matter of territory, as are in the two-realm model, but of purpose and methodology. Limits are not boundaries, marked by fences with no trespassing signs, where theologians and scientists stake out and protect the turf. Rather, the self-imposed limitations are inherently required by the kind of description and language used. See Figure 12. This chart does not show the knowledge of God through any experience or natural theology. Donald Mackay gives the illustration of an electric advertising sign with a running sequence of words. Perched high above the street, hundreds of light bulbs flash on and off to inform viewers that things go better with bongo. Ask an electrician to tell us what, in technical language, what's on the board, and we'll hear words like volts, amperes, resistances, and switches that explain exactly how each lamp flashes at the prescribed time and in sequence. His thorough account of every item and event on the board cannot be considered incomplete, though it does not mention the words in the message and their meaning. For that, we must turn to the advertiser who can account for the sign as a whole, the who and the why behind it. Mackay warns against the prevalent practice of reductionism, which attempts to explain a phenomenon on the basis of a single component. Such nothing buttery explains away whatever is not apparent in that component. For example, some may say a human being is nothing but a collection of atoms, physics, or a combination of compounds, chemistry, or an animal, biology, as if the sign in Mackay's illustrations were nothing but an electrical circuit. Let us return to our pastoral scene and his observers. Beethoven should not say to Einstein, "You cannot analyze my symphony." In fact, a physicist can give an excellent analysis on the sound produced by each instrument in the whole orchestra in terms of wavelengths, frequencies, and decibels. With such a scientific explanation, no more gives the meaning of the music than the electrician communicates a message of the sign. In each case, the limitation is not territorial but methodological. Each partial view of nature serves its intended purpose and should be appreciated for the specific contribution it makes to our lives. The biblical and scientific perspectives on nature can mutually benefit from interacting with each other as allies with complementary approaches. The two perspectives often overlap and interact with each other. The mutual stimulation can be highly productive in the life and research of a scientist. The distinguished 19th century physicist James Clerk Maxwell, for example, combined devout Christian faith and rigorous scientific activity. For him, personal faith in God and commitment to the biblical revelation were profoundly integrated with his scientific understanding. His discovery of the relationship between electricity, magnetism, and light, his expression in a partial of different equations, and his concept of the field of electromagnetic force were among the most significant breakthroughs of the period. Maxwell's theological and philosophical concept of the relational thinking had inspired his scientific imagination, which prepared the way for Einstein, who said of Maxwell's equations, "The formula of these equations is the most important event in physics since Newton's time, not only because of their wealth of content, but also because they form a pattern for the new type of law." A ruggedly independent way of thinking, influenced by his Christian faith, had enabled Maxwell to bridge the mechanistic structure of Newtonian science and open up a new way of understanding the universe. Getting it together. Our study has traced the development of modern science as it emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries. We have focused on its purpose and method as it freed itself from the control of philosophy and theology. Especially important in our scientific age is recognition of the self-imposed limitations of science, the other side of that coin. As Einstein reminded us, modern science does not deal with questions of plan and purpose in nature, or of values or meaning in life. There is no bridge from what is to what ought to be. By the same token, we have seen that the biblical view of nature has its own purpose and self-imposed limitations. It views the who and the why of the universe, the creator and his purposes for nature and for humanity. The biblical message, meant for all cultures and generations, is communicated in the everyday language of sense perception, not the mathematics with which science represents the how of natural events. Much of our task has been to clear away misconceptions that complicate the issues, generate unnecessary misunderstanding, and waste energy in futile efforts. Our study of how to relate the biblical and scientific views of nature has brought us to only the bottom rung, but at least to a rung on the right ladder. There remains a world of work for philosophers and theologians to do, although they can no longer dictate which scientific theories are acceptable. Science may have thrown off the yoke of responsibility, but by no means is it free from philosophical presuppositions or analysis of its method and the meaning of its theories and laws. Further, the relationship of natural science to other perspectives on the world, to disciplines in the social sciences, humanities, and fine arts, is of continuing concern. Likewise, theology must provide an evaluation of both science and technology in light of God's command to be stewards of the earth. Biblical studies freed from futile attempts at doing science can focus on the broader issues of using science and technology for the good of humanity and our environment. You also need a full-fledged theology of nature, including not only a special revelation in the Bible, but a general revelation to human senses and reason. Genesis is not the last word on creation, but the first statement of the theme carried through the Old and New Testament. To understand creation fully, besides looking back to the beginning, we must also look forward to the created world's relationship to Jesus Christ and the new creation he effects. Creation and covenant are integrally related, although traditionally separated. God creates with purpose that gradually become known in historical dealings with his people. Much Christian theology of nature too long has been a satellite of science. Modern society has placed scientism with a great prestige and power at the center of its intellectual universe. All other disciplines are expected to revolve around it, basking in any light it sheds on them. Theology, once called the queen of sciences, thus becomes another planet circling the scientific sun. Concordism, constantly trying to harmonize the Bible with the latest scientific theories, surrenders to this scientism. But no amount of adjusting in its orbit with hermeneutical epicycles, eccentrics, or deference will make biblical teaching fit a scientific framework. Something like an intellectual Copernican revolution is needed to reinstate the biblical view, along with other perspectives, as an independently valid way of representing the natural world. A Christian cosmogony should not be based on any specific astronomy, ancient or modern, or on some other scientific model of the world. The unique position of humanity depends neither on our home and being in the center of the universe, nor our origin having occurred in a specific manner, but on the revelation in Scripture that we are created in the image of God and given authority over the earth. When we start with the biblical view of nature, God's creation and preservation of all the world, all other perspectives can be appreciated in its light. Formidable challenges face Christian theology, yet the ultimate relationships of science and theology, philosophy and humanities and the arts should be demonstrated not so much in a comprehensive system of thought as in human life. God's self-revelation has taken place in history through acts and words and needs to manifest itself in our personal histories. In the last parable of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7:24-27, Jesus compares everyone who hears his words and obeys them to the wise person who built his house on the rock so that it could withstand the most violent storms. Biblical theology arises from life's situations and speaks to them. Of the four scientists we have studied, Johannes Kepler reflected most clearly in his research and writing a connection between theology and science that permeated his daily life. He concluded that Harmonies of the World, his favorite work, on a note of thanksgiving and praise to God. I give thanks to thee, O Lord Creator, who has delighted me with thy creation. I rejoice in thy handiwork. Behold, I have now completed the work of my profession, and I have demonstrated the glory of thy works. My soul praise the Lord thy Creator as long as I shall live. To him be the praise, honor, and glory, world without end. Amen.